Okay, so here, like I said before, it's kind of a little bit of a combination of both a quantitative problem and you have to think of some qualitative stuff that we learned in chapter 5. And so it said basically a heterozygous female is mated with a wild type male. So the heterozygous female has wild type eyes, red eyed, right? And so this is how you'd set it up. So here you have the two X chromosomes. Here you have the X and the Y chromosome. On the male Y chromosome, you have the wild type allele. And on the female, you have both a wild type and a wide eye. So under normal circumstances, right, you could just make this Punnett square and you could mate those two. And what you would expect to come out is you would have all wild type females, right? So here you have homozygous wild type females, heterozygous wild type females. But since wild type is dominant to white eyes, they would, that female would be wild type eye, red eyed. And then you would have a 1-to-1 ratio of wild type eyed males with wild type or with white eyed males. All right, so 1-to-1 ratio. But in this case, it said of it every once in a while, on a rare exception, you would get a wide-eyed female. And so if you think back to the chapter when we were talking about the chromosomal theory, right, that genes are located on chromosomes, one of Bridges, who was, I think, a postdoc in the lab of T.H. Morgan, he used that also as sort of further evidence to suggest that, oh, not only does the patterns we observe in the sex chromosomes explain the patterns of the mutations we're seeing in the phenotypes in the different generations, but then every once in a while, when we get a deviation from the pattern, we go to that fly and we look at it, and what's happened is there's been a disjunction happen in the production of the gametes, and that was sort of like even better information that yes, in fact, it is these things. At the time they didn't know if it was DNA or protein, but this substance, this hereditary substance on these chromosomes, or this hereditary substance is located on these chromosomes. Okay, so let's think back here. This is what I took a little bit of time doing, is drawing this out. So in regular meiosis, right, meiosis is broken up into meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And if we're just going to follow the X chromosome, and this is the female, right? In meiosis 1, you get a separation of the homologous chromosomes, right? So each of these chromosomes has duplicated through in the S phase, right, of the cycle, and so it's formed these sister chromatids, right? And so here you have 2 sister chromatids for each of the X chromosomes. In meiosis 1, you get a separation of those homologous chromosomes, so you get one of the X chromosomes being, eventually ending up in one of the eggs, and the other X chromosome in the other egg. And so here we have the wild type chromosome that contains the wild type allele in this egg, and the chromosome that contains the wild or the white-eyed allele in this one. Under normal circumstances, then after meiosis 2, these 2 cells would eventually form these 4 gametic cells, right? And so then you'd have here, remember the spindle fiber coming in, latching on to the centromere and ripping apart that chromosome, and the same thing that's happening here and ripping it apart. The normal processes have happened with the egg that had the wild type alleles here, so it produces those 2 gametes, both of which X chromosomes have the wild type allele, right? But in this one, what happened is maybe you had the spindle fiber attaching here, and when it started to crank it down and separate them out, one of the sides broke, and so that meant that you didn't get a separation between the sister chromatids, and so one of the eggs actually inherits the chromosome right here that's been duplicated, so it actually has 2 wild type alleles, right? And one of the eggs doesn't have any, right? So essentially, even though these are still fused, there are 2 X chromosomes here. Both of the X chromosomes have the wide-eyed mutation. So then if you get a fertilization that comes in, right, with a Y chromosome, you would then essentially have an XXY individual where both of those X chromosomes have the wide-eyed allele. All right. And so then now, in addition to this, you have to remember, and we didn't do, the book goes into a lot more detail about sex determination with flies. But if you remember, it's not, the sex determination is not dependent at all on the Y chromosome, but rather the ratio of X chromosomes to your autosomes. So an XX female, it has the exact same ratio as an XXY female. It has the exact same ratio of sex chromosomes or Y chromosomes, or sorry, X chromosomes to the autosomes, because the Y is insignificant. And so that's how you would get that wide-eyed female. That make sense, Shelby?
Yeah, I just forgot to account for duplication, so it definitely makes sense now.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's where the two, even though they're connected here, the sister chromatids, is in essence you have those two X chromosomes. And so that was a good one. And again, don't stress with all the details of the sex determination of Drosophila that the chapter goes into. But here, this is a nice reminder, but at least remember that the Y chromosome is insignificant, right? So if you have an XXY individual, that individual is going to be female. Okay.
Okay. Could it also have been like a nullo sperm where there's no Y? I mean, it would have been less likely because there was already non-disjunction, but that could have been a possibility, right?
So you have, no, because remember, the Y doesn't determine the sex. It doesn't.
But if there was non-disjunction in the female and then there was also a sperm that didn't have a Y.
Oh yeah. Either one of
XX?
those.
Okay.
Yeah, either a sperm with a Y or a sperm without a Y. Yeah. You could do that.
Okay. Cool.
That might be a little less likely, but yeah. I thought you were talking about non-disjunction in male. Okay.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Any other questions on that one? All right. Let me stop. Okay, here it goes. Let me stop the recording first. Okay.